Welcome to Advancing the Diaconate, a series devoted to highlighting the work of deacons and their ministries in the world and the church. Now, here's your host.
And hello, everyone. I'm Deacon John Ray of the Diocese of Atlanta. Welcome to another episode of Advancing the Diaconate. We're grateful you're with us. And I'm delighted to welcome Deacon Logan Taylor Augustine. Deacon Taylor, or Deacon Augustine, I guess Taylor Augustine, right?
Augustine is good, or just
Okay,
Logan.
cool. Logan's good. Deacon Logan is from the Diocese of Virginia. Welcome. So glad to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So let's talk about your journey and maybe your journey toward the diaconate, and then we'll get into your call.
That sounds good. So I grew up, my mom grew up in a Lutheran household and my dad grew up in a Baptist household. So when we were coming up, we would visit different churches and did a lot of church shopping and so to speak, and kind of landed in the Lutheran church for a little while. And I always really loved the liturgy. And we attended off and on, but I didn't really kind of come into the church until I was in college. I went through some difficult times in my senior year and followed a good friend of mine who was discerning a call to the priesthood herself, to a church not too far down the street for me in college. And I initially started going to support her and to be a good friend, but found myself quickly being loved and cared for by the parishioners and the clergy around me at this church. And so what started as something where I thought I was helping a friend really ended up bringing me back to life. So I just fell in love with the church and the people and the liturgy, and the familiar words were so comforting. And so I found myself coming back each week when other things were really hard to do. I was able to come back to church. And so graduated from college and thought I wanted to be a history professor. And so I took some time to kind of think about what I wanted to do because I felt this call to do that. But then I was also feeling this real pull to the church and to do some work there. So spent some time trying to figure that out and ended up in seminary, which I look back on that and think, gosh, that was a real jump. From visiting church to going to seminary, but there I was.
Right.
And I got my master's in theology, and my focus was in pastoral care, which looking back, I can see the ways in which people were always caring for me and how much that meant to me, whether it was just showing up and saying hello, sitting next to me, welcoming me in the pew, or the priest spending some extra time with me. I think that's how I felt so healed and found such life in that. And so I think that was probably my draw to pastoral care. And so through doing some of those classes, I was introduced to chaplaincy, and ended up doing 4 units of CPE in the hospital setting and really fell in love with being with people in their worst and hardest moments. So I originally had this heart for chaplaincy, and I had also kind of through all of that, through the process of seminary, thought about the priesthood, but that never quite felt right. So that was kind of what brought me around to the diaconate.
Well, let's say more about that, and
Sure.
maybe you can incorporate your call to the diaconate, because I think a lot of people hearing your lay people for sure that would hear your story would be expecting you right there at the end to say, and then I discern for the priesthood, right? I mean, because all
Right.
that sounds like that's where you're headed.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about how that call to the diaconate really came apparent for you.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I was working in the hospital during my clinical pastoral education, during my residency, and I really kind of I had finished seminary at this point and kept feeling this feeling and this pull to ordination, but yet the priesthood just didn't make sense. I didn't feel called to be grounded in the parish. I didn't feel called to the in the way that a priest would be. And so I remember it was before one of my classes in CPE. I was sitting down on my laptop and I pulled up the Diocese of Virginia's webpage and I was looking through some different things and something about the diaconate came up and I clicked on it. And then I started reading, and the more it talked about that there was some language from the Book of Common Prayer on the ordination of a deacon. And the more I read that language about being out in the world with people, caring for the sick and the marginalized, it was like, oh my gosh, I'm home. I'm home.
Mm.
I think that's what I'm supposed to be doing, because I knew without a shadow of a doubt that I was supposed to be doing chaplaincy. And for a little while, I think maybe I thought, maybe I'm just called to be a lay chaplain.
Hmm.
But I kept coming back around and feeling this push and this nagging feeling, and reading those words, I thought this is something I really need to explore.
Well, let's talk
I'm
about
sorry.
that. Yeah, no, I just wanted to grab onto this while we were there about lay chaplaincy. So why the diaconate versus lay chaplaincy for you?
Hmm. That's a really good question. Um, and this may sound strange. I felt incomplete. Like I felt like there was a part of my call that I was not living out fully
Hmm.
without being ordained.
Mm.
And there was also the deacon functioning in liturgy to me was really important. Being able to function in that way, it's not just we're not just there to perform a function in the liturgy. It's a symbol.
Hmm.
And so, when we're giving the dismissal and we're calling people to go out into the world, we're that symbol that church, the church service is not ending there. In fact, it's just beginning. We're going out into the world. And
Right.
so, living out my call as a chaplain and taking care of other people is also then I am living that and proclaiming that in the liturgy as well.
Yeah, we just happen to have stopped at this place in time for spiritual refreshment and nourishment, and now we're going
Hmm.
back to where we belong, right out into the world. I mean, does that capture what you're thinking?
Yep, that's it.
Yeah. So let's talk about the priesthood and why that that wasn't the call that made you feel complete.
Hmm.
And I guess talk about the reaction that you get maybe from people when they hear that you've got that advanced degree and you've got your CPE and your certifications as a chaplain. You sound like a priest, Logan.
I've heard that
I bet
before.
you have.
I
Yeah.
have. The other
Hmm.
things sound that
Yeah.
way. But I think, I have a heart for the diaconate
Hmm.
and I belong out in the world.
Right.
And I do feel called to the language about interpreting to the church the needs of the world. And so I think being able to share that with other people is really important to me. That's been one of the great things about working at Westminster Canterbury, particularly within the memory support community, and offering the care to those folks. And then I have my younger independent living residents who will say things like, "Well, how come you didn't go all the way and go and become ordained a priest?" And
Mm.
so helping them to understand how I'm called and how the call is equal but different, I think is really important. I felt what I normally explain to them is, or that was helpful for me, that helpful distinction, the priest being called to word and sacrament, and the deacon being called to word and service.
Mm.
And so that piece of service for me in the function of the liturgy and in the function of going out into the world to care for God's people, is really what speaks to me. I also have a particular call for taking care of people who are not churched, or people who have been hurt by the church. And so I feel like I have a particular place beyond the church walls that makes sense for me to be out caring for people for whom maybe traditional religion doesn't resonate, or who have been hurt in some way, but to act as a person of love
Mm-hmm.
and deep abiding presence for them in the midst of whatever pain or struggles that they're going through.
Wow. Uh, that's got to be both hard and fulfilling work.
It is hard and fulfilling at the same time.
Hmm.
I found Samuel Wells wrote a Nazareth Manifesto, and we read that in deacon school. I found that book to be really helpful. It talks a lot about being with,
Mm.
this concept of being with people as God is with us. And there's a lot about the diaconate where we're out and we're going and we're doing, and taking care of others, and uh, addressing systems of injustice and oppression. Um, and those things are extremely important. And not but I think it's also important to be with people, and that's where I feel called to be.
Now, speaking of both hard and fulfilling, um, you've got a special call, and that's motherhood and
Mm.
family, and trying to balance that um, uh, great mission in your life with your diaconal responsibilities. So, talk about
Mhm.
out that juggling act for you.
Mm. It's hard, and I'm still figuring it out every day. I got married to my husband 2 weeks before I was ordained to the diaconate.
Hmm.
Um, and I remember my bishop telling me at the time, It's interesting that you're taking vows to your husband 2 weeks before you're taking vows to the diaconate." And so
Uh-huh.
she talked about holding both of those sets of sacred vows,
Mm.
and how they're equally important, and that God calls us to take care of ourselves and our marriage and our family, just as we're called to also take care of other people.
Mm.
And so that's been kind of a helpful grounding and guiding um, thing for me too. That it's, if I'm not well and I'm not taking care of myself and my family, then I'm not going to be any good to anybody else. So I certainly don't get it right all the time, but I try to make that a mantra, so that to kind of empower me to say no to commitments when I can't do it, um, and to know when to let things go, and to let things be messy, figuratively and literally.
Well, let's talk about the special, and you've touched on some of them, of course, but some of the special and unique issues that a younger deacon like you um, has to deal with, and like an old guy like me doesn't have to worry about. Um,
Mm,
talk about some of that.
sure. I know one of the challenges for me, I'm in my mid 30s now. I was in my late 20s when I was going through discernment and going to deacon school.
Hmm.
And so funding those kinds of things, school and books and all of that is hard. It's certainly a challenge, especially when you're younger and your salary is not quite as great. And
Hmm.
chaplaincy is wonderful, but it's not a high paying career.
Right.
um, and so certainly, I think the financial aspect can certainly be a challenge for a younger person.
Hmm.
I think also trying to balance that with, I remember talking to the dean of my deacon school, and she talked about the unique challenges that a young deacon has, or a young at the time to postulant or candidate, because there's so much that's also new. It's not just deacon school; it's being a young adult and perhaps having a relationship, or a new marriage, or a new family, and trying to balance all of those new things at the same time. is really challenging.
Yeah. How have you and your husband, how have you navigated this, and what do the two of you do to, I guess, really take care of each other? He takes care of you, and you take care of him when it comes to the special challenges each of you have, given the work that you do.
Sure, certainly. Because it's demanding. And, we've talked about before as a couple, there are times where he has felt like I've neglected him because a lot of my emotional time and presence and effort goes to the care of my residents.
Hmm.
So I think open communication and talking to one another, being really clear about what our needs are and honest about that, and taking time away for just the two of us is so important. I think that's taken at least me a little while to get there, because I always feel like there's another need or there's something else at work or somebody who needs something, and I know I have a tendency to put us on the back burner. So making time together as a couple a priority is really important. Just
Well,
being
and
intentional about the time, I think.
yeah, yeah. Well, and boundaries are an issue with
Mhm.
all of us, right? I mean,
Right.
regardless of our age and stage, is drawing those boundaries, and that's what we all learn.
That's right. Boundaries are tough. And I think too, being younger and in the workplace and drawing a boundary and not wanting to be seen as not caring or not committed and all of those things. And that comes too, I think, with developing personal and pastoral identity. And it takes some time. It's
Yeah,
tough.
yeah, yeah, for sure. And you were ordained what year? How long have you?
2018.
Okay, awesome. We were in the same class then. Not
Ah, okay.
different diocese, same
Diocese, same
class. We
class.
had different
Okay.
diocesan mothers, so there you go.
Okay.
Yeah. Um, well, let's give some advice for younger, I guess maybe postulants and those that are discerning for the diaconate, that are in their 20s and 30s. And what advice would you give them?
Hmm.
Everybody's got a different journey, but what
Sure.
advice would you give them as they assess their call?
Hmm. I would say find other deacons to talk to, particularly younger deacons. I think is really helpful. I know I didn't have as many. I had a couple, but maybe not as many younger deacons to talk to in my area. So
Mhm.
I do think it makes a big difference to talk to some other people who are younger and who have gone through this. And I think finding a spiritual director and a therapist can also be really helpful. Something that was helpful to me.
Mm.
My friends, when I was going through that in my 20s, were in a very different headspace than I was. And so it helped to be able to have some other people who were trained and skilled in talking about those kinds of things to process with as well.
So I'm on the board of the Fund for the Diaconate. That's the Fund for the Diaconate, along with the Association for Episcopal Deacons, or uh, support this initiative around advancing the diaconate in this series that we're doing. You've got a special intersection with the Fund for the Diaconate.
Mhm.
I'm going to let you describe that.
Sure. So my husband and I, in the height of COVID, oop, my daughter's book was making a sound. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's
um,
that is perfectly appropriate.
yeah. So we were in the middle of COVID, and I was pregnant with my daughter, and she was born in the spring of 2021.
Mm,
And I continued in my chaplaincy work. That was quite tough with COVID and being pregnant, but
yeah.
I'm fortunate I was able to continue in that work and keep my job. But my husband was working in the music industry. And so naturally, when COVID happened, lots of all shows and entertainment were completely shut down. And so his business, it was his own small business, really took a big hit.
Hmm.
And so we learned about the fund through Teresa, and she
Shout out to Teresa.
that's right. she
Yeah.
she encouraged. I was just talking with her. She's in my diocese, and just having a conversation with her. And she said, you might consider applying for this.
Mhm.
And so we did, and it gave us some much needed relief with a newborn baby for over the course of a good number of months. It was really helpful when we were, pretty much depending on my chaplain's salary alone.
Mhm.
It was
Yeah.
a huge help with month to month expenses until he
And
could kind of recover and get back on his feet again.
right. And so this was and for those that don't know Teresa, there Teresa Llewellyn, our grants administrator at the fund. So you intersected with her. She also happens to be in your diocese, correct? So that
Right.
you knew her firsthand. And so you applied for an emergency grant through the fund, and the fund does grant. Uh, well, there were both COVID and emergency grants, and we won't get into the difference in the two for right now. But the point is that that money exists to help deacons that are going through a rough patch or have some sort of extraordinary circumstances they need help with.
That's right. It was tremendously helpful. I One of the things that was also a challenge was having I had just gone back to work from maternity leave.
Mm,
And through in my work, we have to use all of our PTO or paid time off for our maternity leave. And so I had accrued about 3 or 4 weeks worth of time, and I had to use it when I got back to work.
mm,
And my daughter went to daycare, and she would sick. And of course, it was
mm,
COVID, so her classroom would shut down every so often for 2 weeks at a time.
mhm,
Um, and so I would be if I was home with her and I didn't have any PTO, I didn't get paid.
mm.
So that certainly contributed to some of the financial stress we were experiencing as well.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up because really what we're talking about here is not just financial aid. We're talking about some psychological aid along the way that comes with that, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's a great point.
Yeah. That must have been a very stressful time.
It
Um,
was unbelievable. It was
yeah.
very stressful. Really, really hard. It truly
Yeah.
was.
Um, Obviously you leaned on the good Lord, but how did
Mhm.
you and your husband, how did the two of you come through that the way you did?
Hmm. Yeah, faith and lots of prayer and
Mm,
really leaning on each other.
mhm,
And we both have good family support. That made a difference too,
mhm.
having the emotional support of our families.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was tough.
Mm. Well, you have come on the other side of that, and you have um, are now that we're out of the pandemic and things have kind of normalized a little bit for you and your
Right.
family, right?
That's right. Yes, we still have some COVID protocols at work, but it feels much more normal now. It's normal as it can be.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, so understanding that obviously the limits of confidentiality as a chaplain, I would love it if maybe you could tell a story or two that kind of reflect a parable or two that reflect your ministry and how you see God showing up in your ministry.
Sure. So we have in my memory support population, we have a couple different areas of care. One is within assisted living, and I run a couple spirituality groups every week, and in those different areas, so that every resident within memory care has the opportunity to attend one of these groups. And so I run one of these groups with a particular group of residents who are quite a bit further along in the dementia process. And there's a woman who's been coming now for 4 years, at least since I've been there, um, every single Tuesday. And she has changed over time and has particularly declined recently. She used to be a little bit more oriented to her time and place, and now couldn't tell you where she is or what's going on or what year it is. And things that were really important to her, like the Lord's Prayer that she would recite as a part of our time together, she can't say anymore.
Mm.
But prayer, personal prayer, continues to be tremendous to her. And so one of the things that we do in our group after we've sang some familiar hymns and read a familiar scripture is to go around the room and offer prayer requests. So we'll call her Jane. And so I was coming around the circle and I asked Jane what she would like to pray for. And she looks right at me and clear as day says, I would like to pray that we all know the love of God. And I would like for God to show me the people around me who really need his love the most so that I can show up for them and be present with them, sit with them, and just love them.
Mm.
And
Wow.
so I am always amazed at the profound way that these folks who are just, very confused and really, Jane can't tell me where her apartment is, and she has lived there for years and years. And yet in this moment, when we're engaging her faith, which has been important to her for 86 years,
Mm-hmm.
even though other things have changed and shifted, there is still this part of her that she's able to express her love for God and her love for God's people. And I think being able to, not anything special that I'm doing, but creating this space and being hopefully a presence for her where she can share these things is really powerful.
As you tell that powerful story, Logan, it makes me think of something we talk about as deacons when we get together, and that is that we don't serve from a position of superiority or on a pedestal downward. That we receive, and we are changed by those who we are present with.
Mm-hmm.
And that's wow. I mean, I can feel that just hearing you tell that story. So wow.
Yeah, I had another visit this week. One of my residents passed away. She had had a long struggle and had a stroke recently. So she had passed, and her daughter, we'll call her Kristen, arrived and asked for the chaplain to come by and to support her. And she was just she talked about how intellectually she had processed that this was going to happen. Mm-hmm. And what loss looks like and what grief looks like. But she said emotionally, she just wasn't prepared and her heart was breaking. Mm. And she looked at me and she said, I know this sounds crazy, but I'm wondering if you have any magic words that could fix this for me. Mm. And my heart kind of broke for her. Mm-hmm. And it occurred to me, there are times when we can't fix that kind of pain. And we can't fix that kind of grief, but we do show up and we hold presence for people, and we give witness and bear witness to their pain and their grief, just like the psalmist lamented, like Rachel cried out, and like Jesus wept at the grave of his friend.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that really, for anyone, that whether you're a deacon or a lay person, that you're trying to do some lay chaplaincy, you're what you're really talking about there is it really takes some of the pressure off, right? Because I think sometimes people feel like they've got to come up with the magic words,
right?
And there are no magic words, but there is a sense of holiness in that presence. Mm-hmm. That is so vital, and that's what you've obviously are holding for the people you serve.
Thank you.
Yeah. Wow.
It's a sacred honor to walk alongside these people. It really is.
Wow. That's such marvelous work. Logan Taylor Augustine, we're just honored to have spoken with you today and to hear about your work and what you're up to as a deacon. And God bless you and grant you many years of fruitful ministry.
Thank
as
you.
a deacon. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you, John, for what you're doing with the fund and advancing the diaconate. Really important work.
Thank you. Before I let you go, though, if there's anyone out there that would like to know more about your ministry and particularly your experience as a deacon, can they get in touch? And if so, how can they contact you?
Absolutely. They're welcome to. I can provide my email. Is that
Okay. Sure.
good, John? Okay.
Yeah, that'll work.
All right. Should I just, what's the best, what you want me to just say?
Yeah. Why don't you just read it out and
Sure.
we'll try to put it somewhere in the show notes too. How about that?
Okay, perfect. That'll work. It's Anne, ANNE, and then the letter L, Taylor, TAYLOR 86 @gmail.com.
Terrific. Deacon Logan Taylor Augustine, you are awesome. We appreciate you, and you're an inspiration to all of us deacons, and I know all those that you come into contact with. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deacon John. Appreciate you.
Thank you. And listeners, just a reminder, this series, Advancing the Diaconate, is a joint endeavor of the Association for Episcopal Deacons and the Fund for the Diaconate. This series is devoted to highlighting the work of deacons and their ministries in the world and in the church. It's also part of a fundraising campaign to support deacons in their work. And if you'd like to learn more on how to support deacons and those they serve, you can go to episcopaldeacons.org. That's the site for AED, the Association for Episcopal Deacons. You can email campaign@episcopaldeacons.org and someone will get back to you. Or you can email treasurer@fundfordiaconate.org. Fundfordiaconate.org is the website for the Fund for the Diaconate. And you can email treasurer@fundfordiaconate.org if you're interested in supporting the work of the fund, as the fund supports deacons that have extraordinary needs that the fund can address. So again, for my guest, Deacon Logan Taylor Augustine, I'm Deacon John Ray. Thank you so much for joining us on this edition of Advancing the Diaconate.
Thank you for joining us on Advancing the Diaconate. This series is a joint production of the Association for Episcopal Deacons and the Fund for the Diaconate, who support deacons in their ministries today and tomorrow. Join them and add your support for deacons.